Okay, well, welcome everybody to this session. I'm going to cover chapters 7, 8, and 9 of Volume 1 of Capital, and the sort of the overriding theme of those three chapters is an explanation of surplus value. So I'm very pleased to see people here, and I hope we have a good discussion. I think it will take about 15 minutes for me to get through the material. There aren't that many jokes, I'm afraid, so you just have to try and concentrate as we go through. So you can see on the left there the basic agenda that I'm going to follow. Before I start formally, I do want to make two very quick announcements, and it's sort of like a contrast to this picture here, which is very sort of, most of it's quite techy in terms of what capitalism is, right? For me, it's all about social movements and working class and other resistance. And I want you to know, because I'm using my platform basically to let you know about a fight in Germany of a Tamil comrade who, if he is deported, will almost certainly be tortured and possibly killed. So if you can help with this urgent action, I do invite you to. It's in German, that page, but I think it's quite easy now to do a sort of quick translation. So that's the first special announcement, me using my platform the way I can. This one is very big contrast. I mean, so the fight goes on obviously against deportations, but the second one is about Francia Marquez, and I thank Amanda for passing me on this link. So we have Colombia's first president, left of center, let's say, and the vice president, Francia Marquez, comes directly from the social movements, and you can hear her first words since her election on this link. Again, there's a way of, can't do it now, I won't do it now, but even maybe in the discussion session, if not, there's a way of getting it in English if you don't have Spanish, certainly the subtitles. So that's a parenthesis while we warm up. Let's get on then with the main point of you being here. So somebody's got their mic still on. I'm not quite sure who that is. I'm just hear it in the background. Okay, so a review of what we looked at last time and what you've been reading in the last month or so. Part 2 of Volume 1 is definitely about transition. It's a transition from the simple commodity production and circulation that Marx has gone into in a great length in Part 1. And it comes to the point where money becomes capital. And this sort of notion of becoming is a sort of like an initial positing of capital in circulation. So it's we'll see in a moment, it's money that becomes more money. And from this, Marx explains the necessity of a move into production to explain how money is actually acting as capital. And so he sort of really explains quite fully the necessity of capitalist production for capital at all. So part 2 is in 3 chapters. I think you're fairly familiar with this notation, which was started in simple circulation, of the idea of 2 commodities, the producer of one commodity being able to sell their commodity and get money from it, sale, and then using that money to buy another commodity. What you have here is a preservation of value. There's no increase in value through that simple circuit. And Marx contrasts what he posits as one level, just a formal difference, but he says very definitely behind this formality lies a whole historical epoch. And that is a different movement through circulation, which starts with money rather than the commodity. Commodity is purchased, and after the sale of that commodity, the amount of money has increased, and he shows that by this M dash. And so this is the general formula for capital. And the general formula for capital is all about an increase in the amount of money from beginning to end. And that amount of increase Marx calls surplus value. It's purely quantitative. There's no real change in any use value. At the end of the day, it's just more money. Now, this expansion of money acting as capital is translated into English as valorization. This is the valorization of capital. And in this first presentation of the topic, it would appear that this is money kind of magically expanding itself, valorizing itself. And this is posited by Marx. It's almost like tongue-in-cheek. Do we believe this to be the case? This self-valorization. I'm not going to pronounce the German, I won't embarrass myself, but it does come quite close to, at first sight, at least, a Hegelian type idea of an autonomous substance subject, sort of like an all-powerful self-moving being, which is able to control everything around itself. And I say apparently, because we'll see that he actually pulls the rug underneath the feet of this idea. And he does that by looking at the contradictions in the general formula. He shows that it reaches a double result, where, and this is important, both sides of this point are actually important. It's impossible for money to arise in circulation, but it's equally impossible for it to arise apart from circulation. That's a very carefully worded phrase there, right? So it must have its origin both in circulation and not in circulation. Now that this seems to be sort of like, what's the word, a paradox. It's not a paradox, but it's actually the expression of a deep contradiction. And what he's proving is that the source of this additional value, this surplus value, must come from somewhere else. He's got another notation, which is the same as M to M dash, which is M plus delta M. So delta M is the surplus value, this increase in value. And so what is this something else? So Marx takes the argument very methodically and convincingly, I think, to the sale and purchase of labor power. Labor power is the something else. It's the C in the middle of MC M dash, which is bought and then sold, right? It's distinct from labor activity. It's labor power, right? So capital buys labor power in order to use it to increase value, because when it's put to use, labor power is labor, and labor produces value and surplus value. So what Marx is going to take the reader into from here is, how does that happen? He's, if you like, positing that it must happen and it must be from production. And the next step in his argument, which is very clearly sort of signposted as we go through, is, okay, how does that happen? How does capital appropriate surplus value from labor power? Now, in my commentary on this part, I was saying, I think that he uses a lot of the concepts from part one, but it's important to sort of, well, let's evaluate it, right? It's significant that he uses concepts, but he begins to use them differently. So nothing is ever quite fixed, okay? And so what a commodity is and what labor is and what money is begin to shift a little bit under this new reality. And what he brings out more than anything else in chapter 6 in particular is that labor power is a commodity, but it's a commodity unlike any other. And what is unique about labor power when it becomes a commodity is that its own special use value when it's consumed is that it produces value. And I thank John for reminding me of this, very well discussed by Ilyenkov. So you look that up, it's quite accessible, get hold of that, okay? Now, this also allows us to reflect from the benefit of having got into the transition what was going on in part one. And it does strike me, I want to make a comment about this because it's a subject of a lot of debate. Looking back at part one from this slight vantage point, I would say that part one is very much an abstraction from the capitalist mode of production. Okay, certainly labor power was not commodified in the type of commodity production that Marx is looking at there. And so it's not really an abstraction of the capitalist mode of production, it's an abstraction from it. So it's a point of contrast, okay? It's very interesting the way Marx uses quite a some of the material from the later part 8, which we started reading Capital Volume 1 by looking at part 8. And I think Marx advised this at one point. And he does this, and he brings out this notion of capital accumulating on the one hand and free labor on the other hand as being the basic precondition, the result of primitive accumulation, which is the basic precondition of a class relation. Now I critique it not for that point, but for the idea that that's the universal form. And there's phrases there which you may remember me talking about, which is the notion of the laborer being able to sell their own labor power without any dependencies. And the point is that was not always the case, particularly with when you're talking about enslaved labor and indeed other forms of labor such as child labor and so on. Right. So it's a general case, but not the universal case. And the other sort of point where Marx's big breakthrough here can be built on further is the question of unpaid domestic labor. What is the value of labor power? If it, Marx says, well, it's the value of the commodities that go into the reproduction of labor power. He also, without really any distinction, says it's the value of the means of subsistence which go into the production of labor power. But there's a gap there. There is a gap, which is the missing role of unpaid domestic labor in the production of labor power. So the concept is fine. It's a question of it needs further development to include the necessarily gendered relations, capitalist social relations of the reproduction of labor power. So that's my quick review of part 1. Of part 2, which leads us in now to what we're going to be looking at today and over the next month. So what you can see is a movement from circulation decisively into production now. And what Marx is going to be doing in these 3 chapters is looking at surplus value as such before he goes into the different dimensions or configurations of surplus value, and also the aspects of its external expression and reproduction as a totality. So I think this could have come out as a separate part in its own right, actually, although it's under the heading of part 3, absolute surplus value. These 3 chapters are building towards that, but they're actually not directly talking about absolute surplus value. They're talking about a more general concept of surplus value. And surplus value as such, before we go into any particular configuration of it. Okay, that's quite an important point in terms of the structure of Marx's argument. So we're going from circulation into production. We're going into the essential relation of the capitalist mode of production. Okay, chapter 7 is in 2 parts. The title of this chapter is particularly important. The labor process on the one hand and the valorization process on the other. And Marx explains what each one is and puts them directly in contrast with each other. He's very strong control as an author, what he's doing here. Okay, so we look at the contrast of production, first of all, from the perspective of producing use values. And then from there, he goes into production of surplus value. So this first section on the labor process, in fact, they're not subheadings, but I would give it 3 sort of subheadings. First of all, he looks at what the labor process must be for any society. There's a necessary materiality to the way social labor interacts with nature. He sees this as a purposeful activity. He makes some distinctions between humans and animals, which some people may want to argue about, human beings being users of tools and so on. But the general point is that certainly human interaction in terms of labor processes is with a purpose. And it must involve raw materials and it must involve instruments of production. And he has some discussion about how nature can provide things. Let me think quickly of an example, like coal. No, not coal. Can be both. Okay. I think he gives the example of cattle and animals. Can somebody turn off their mute themselves, please? Right. The next section here under 7.1 is the dialectic of product and process. And Marx is really convincing, I think, in this section. He contrasts the objectification, which is the result of the process, and the process itself. And he's quite schematic in a sense. It's quite general, and in a sense, and he often says this. You might think these are just tautologists, if you like, but he's just sort of mapping things out here, right? He's laying the ground for the development of his argument. And he talks about production processes being linked between inputs and outputs. And the inputs can be directly from nature, as well as things that have already been worked on in an earlier stage by labor. And then he brings in another concept, which is quite important. Up to now, when we've talked about commodities being bought, under simple circulation, it's generally been sort of assumed that this is for the, the reading of the Bible or the drinking of the brandy or the wearing of the coat. It's sort of like personal consumption. But what he brings in here, of course, is as soon as you start thinking about these linked up processes, then it can be that a given object is actually being consumed in production. So we have this idea of productive consumption. Okay, they're always present. You can imagine how they might be configured in different societies historically, or even in future societies, hopefully, right? But what he's moving on to from this sort of launch point of this part of his argument is how they work in a particular way in the capitalist mode of production. And he starts off by looking at it from the angle of the capitalist production of use values. And he sort of emphasizes that once the wage is paid and the commodity labor power is sold, then the worker's time belongs to the capitalist. And not only their time belongs to the capitalist, but everything that they produce belongs to the capitalist. And again, this is a point of contrast, if you remember, with simple commodity production and circulation, where it's kind of assumed that those who produce commodities are the ones who can sell them. Well, here, capital owns and controls the means of production and owns and controls the product of the process, right? So everything is basically all in the hands of the capitalist. The other interesting thing, he doesn't use the terms, but when you read through this, you'll begin to see he's beginning to rework this concept of abstract and concrete labor, how labor is both producing use values on the one hand and producing value on the other, which is how we introduced it right at the very beginning of volume 1. Okay, so that's the first half of the chapter. Now let's bring in the second part of the chapter, which is really a very accomplished explanation of his core theory now, and he does this through the heading of the valorization process. Now, the translation of this in the Lawrence and Wishart edition is the process of producing surplus value. Okay. Now, again, he's contrasting this with simple commodity production, and in the capitalist valorization process, we have the productive consumption of labor power. And the consumption of labor power is the equivalent, it's the other side of having a directed labor activity. So the two are sort of two sides of the same story. So the concepts are importantly distinct, but you cannot separate them either. And this is a very important sort of a framing which Marx uses time and time again. They're related but distinct, okay? So labor activity has two aspects. He works on this again, and I'm just going to outline the first example he gives. And this happens to be the first example of capitalist production. And he's setting up what's the particular thing that's capitalist about capitalist production. So he sets it up with a capitalist has got the worker, they've paid their wages, they've got the machines, they've got the cotton. Example is spinning of yarn, and after the work has been put to work for 6 hours, they've basically used up all the cotton, they've used up the wear and tear of the spindle, and they've produced enough which replaces the value of their own wages. And they've now got a commodity product which is equal in value to all the capital advance in buying the elements in the first place. And so this is 15 shillings. So after 6 hours of labor, the worker has reproduced the value of their own labor power through their new activity. And that's it. I mean, as far as they're concerned, they can go home now and end of story. But capitalist is not happy with this state of affairs, as you may imagine, right? Because there is no surplus value. And so why does he bother? If M at the end is the same as M at the beginning, Marx actually uses the term absurd back in one of the earlier chapters, right? I mean, so the whole purpose is that there's more money at the end than there was at the beginning, the production of surplus value. Otherwise, why does the capitalist do it at all? So in order to solve this problem for the capitalist, they have to get the worker to work longer. And I got to do it, there we are. So the way the capitalist gets their surplus value is by getting the worker, obliging the worker to work not just 6 hours, but to work for 12 hours. So in that time, they're going to use up twice as much cotton, because the consumption of cotton will proceed proportionately at the same rate. They will wear and tear down the spindles more or less at the same rate as well. But the wages don't change because the labor power is already bought and the capitalist has paid for the use of that labor power for a whole day. So at the end of this period, twice as much cotton yarn is now produced, and instead of 15 shillings, we have a value of 30 shillings. But the capitalist didn't pay 30 shillings didn't advance as capital 30 shillings, they only advanced 27 shillings. So now the capitalist is happy because he's got his extra 3 shillings, which he didn't have before. And this 3 shillings, the purple patch for the capitalist is the surplus value. Right. This is a very straightforward sort of entry into the concept of capitalist production of surplus value. It's used by Engels in his edited version of Wage, Labour and Capital. You may have come across it before. And it's at the surface, it conforms completely to, so if you like, normal capitalist bookkeeping. So you've paid out wages 3, cotton 20, spindle wear and tear 4, that all adds up to 27. That's on the expenditure side. Then on the income side, so long as the cotton yarn sells at the price that it realizes its own value, it will sell for 30 shillings. But 27 shillings was paid out at the first place, so you got a profit of 3. Now, capitalist sees this as a profit. What Marx explains is where this profit came from. It came from the additional 6 hours of labor from the worker put to work by the capitalist. And so these are the questions that I mean, this is borrowed from a talk I have on wage, labour and capital, and you may want to just refer back to that. I think the numbers are slightly different checking back today, but the very similar example that Engels adopts for popular presentation of Marx's ideas. Marx moves on under valorization to consider other aspects of labour being the subject in capitalist production. Okay. And this is a summary of what I've just said. Capital appropriates surplus value from labour in the form, and this is important, of the value objectified in commodities by making the workers continuing labouring for longer than is required to produce the equivalent of their own labour power. Now, this is a social class relation, without a doubt, but it's got an economic result. Okay, it's a social relation with an economic result, which is the form of capitalist commodities. So Marx looks at this process a bit deeper. You know how he is. He's very methodical. He sort of keeps twisting it around and looking at it from a slightly different angle. So from the perspective of valorization, the raw materials and so on are there. Their job from this perspective is simply to absorb the labor. The purpose here is not to produce use values. It's not even to produce value. The purpose is to produce surplus value. I mean, if it was just stuck at 6 hours, it would have produced a value of worth 15 shillings worth of cotton yarn. But that's not the point. The point is to produce surplus value. And with the production of surplus value in capitalist production, capital is reproducing itself. Capitalist production is the production of capital. Okay. And this is a sort of like a good summary quote of Marx's argument here. He says the production process, considered as the unity of the labor process and the process of creating value, is the process of production of commodities. Now, in fact, this is what he's already covered, although he didn't say a great deal about the labor process back in chapter 1, but he'd already had covered this basic idea in chapter 1. He's going on beyond that now. Considered as the unity of the labor process, and the process of valorization, it is the capitalist process of production, or the capitalist form of the production of commodities. And when he says form here, he's talking about method, way, mode, configuration, capitalist way of doing things. Okay. Right. Now, chapter 8 is about constant capital and variable capital. Constant capital, excuse me, I just got to kill something. Constant capital and variable capital are the two different factors of the labor process that play in the formation. These are two parts of capital, but they play a different role in the formation of the product's value. And once again, he keeps developing this idea of the twofold character of labor. And he starts out by saying the worker adds fresh value. Okay. And at the same time, the labor transfers the value of the means of production. So by the very act of adding new value, the worker, preserves these former values. So there's two things going on at the same time. There's the movement of new value, and there's a preservation of the existing value, the value of the cotton and the value of the wearing down spindles. And he looks at this in quite a lot of, he develops this a lot, right? So the labor activity is producing new use values as it produces value. It's producing a yarn, which is a new use value. The addition of new value takes place not by virtue of his labor being spinning in particular or joinery in particular. This is the concrete side, but because it is labor in general, abstract social labor. The value added is of a certain definite amount, not because his labor has a particular useful content, which it has, but because it lasts for a definite length of time. Excuse my rather weak pun there. It's a new spin on the double nature of labor producing commodities, but now under capitalist conditions. He revisits the duality of labor, and he says that the abstract aspect is that which creates fresh value, and concrete labor is that which recreates the existing value. He then discusses labor productivity, and he gives an example. He doesn't discuss this at great extent. He just throws in an example, which is kind of like a seed for, I think, for a later discussion, right? But he says, okay, well, suppose that spinning workers become 6 times more productive, which they did certainly during his lifetime. So it's not like an outrageous point to make. It happened with the introduction of machinery. So that in 6 hours, 36 pound of yarn is produced, whereas before only 6 pound of yarn was produced. Okay, so each pound of yarn has 1/6 of the socially necessary labor time of labor than it had before. So if you like, the socially necessary labor time has gone down. Okay, this shows that the two properties of labor, by virtue of which it is enabled in one case to preserve value and the other to create value within the same individual process, are different in their very essence. Okay, he's saying that in the one case the use values have increased, but the value overall has stayed the same, and because the use values have increased, the volume has increased, then the value of each unit has gone down proportionately to 1/6. And this is the worked example that he gives And so this is just me trying to make a bit clearer than perhaps I have done so far, what he's going on about. So if you had cotton at 11 pence, there's 12 pence in a shilling, which we may need to remember very soon. So cotton is, these are very realistic figures, by the way. He knew the data quite well about the whole question of cotton spinning and weaving. 11 pence a pound plus wear and tear of a penny, that meant that there's 12 pence that's being transferred. Now, in the first case, before this increase in productivity, it takes 1 hour to produce a pound, right? So that means that 6 pence of value is added. So it's a 12 plus 6, 18 pence for a pound of yarn. In the new situation, once this becomes the social norm that all the producers are producing at this much higher level of productivity, such that it just takes, in effect, 10 minutes, 1/6 of an hour to produce a pound, then that's adding just 1 pence in money terms of value onto the 12 pence of the input values. Okay, so that's what he's talking about. And this, of course, is a major dynamic of capitalist mode of production, this drive to increase productivity, not for its own sake, but this is what he's going to come on to, a relative surplus value. But for the capitalist who's the first one to do this, they can sell their cotton much cheaper than their rivals and make an awful lot of money. Okay, within this chapter, this is another sort of subheading which I've given it, differentiated unity of elements. So what are those elements? Well, we know we've got the means of production. Okay, they don't transfer value. Basically, that's what they don't transfer more value than what with which they started. And he discusses this a bit. He compares how machines work compared to raw materials and so on. The machine is always there in production because it's a thing with which workers are producing. So in use terms, in technical terms, it's a constant presence, but in value terms, it hands over its value bit by bit as it wears out over a period of time. Might be a year, 3 years, 10 years. Okay, so there's a slight deterioration in the value of the machine as it goes through its extended life. Okay, now by contrast, productive labor is the only part where the value goes through I beg your pardon. Sorry, I misspoke there slightly. He's still talking about the machines and the raw materials here, but he's saying that they're being acted on by productive labor. And what productive labor does is, I never came across this term before except used by Marx, but maybe you knew it, but the synonym is reincarnation, right? So the original value of the cotton and the spindle is reincarnated in the yarn. It's the same value in a transformed use value. So if you like, it reappears. It's a sort of it's almost like science fiction in a sense. It sort of like appears somewhere else. It's been transmigrated into a different place. Now, Marx makes a crucial distinction between this idea of reincarnation or reappearance of value and what he calls the reproduction of value, which is what the activity of labor power, putting labor power to work, means that the worker is reproducing the equivalent of the value of the labor power. And if they go on beyond 6 hours, for example, they will produce more than the equivalent of their labor power. Okay, so labor power and purposeful labor activity have to be related here, right? The exchange of money for labor power is in circulation. You know, that's a contract, if you like. The expenditure of labor is in production, where new value is made. And this is, if you like, a different type of exchange. There's a double relation going on here. Right, so with this, Marx is now able to tell us what the difference is quite fully between constant capital, which is that part of the capital which becomes means of production when they're bought and does not undergo any quantitative alteration of value in the process of production. And he creates a term variable capital for that part of capital which is turned into labor power, but which does undergo an alteration of its value in the process of production, because it reproduces the equivalent of its own value plus an excess. Now, from experience, people have a slight problem distinguishing between variable capital and wages. Okay, so it's an exchange. The worker gets the wages and they sell their commodity labor power to the capitalists, right? So the capitalist preserves the value of their variable capital. At first, it's in the form of money. They pay the worker. Then they get a commodity whose value is the same as the money they paid, and that's the labor power. And so variable capital has two forms. It's got a money form and it becomes a material form. Okay, it's a commodity in the hands of capital. And similarly, not exactly the same, because the money doesn't go to, it goes to the owner of the cotton, which is not the actual direct laborer, but somebody else, a third party. Okay, but the cotton is bought, and this is a part of money which is paid out of the capital advanced, and it becomes part of capitalist control, but it's still constant capital. So within the domain of production, you have variable capital and constant capital. Okay. This link is worth following up. It's quite a nice, it's only a short clip. It's about a 90-second clip of a woman worker using one of these old spinning machines, which Marx is writing so much about. So you can get some idea of what he was writing about from that clip. Okay, the third of these three chapters is the rate of surplus value. And now we really are at the nub of Marx's argument, okay? This is also important from the point of view of extending Marx's argument from the question of exploitation to super-exploitation. But let's just start with his argument, which is the degree of exploitation of labor power. He calls the surplus value generated by the capital advance. So big C is the capital advanced, okay? New symbol, but not that difficult to get, right? So the capital advance, which is the cotton, the wages, and the wearing down of the spindle, he says, okay, we call that big C, and it's got two elements. It's got the constant capital and the variable capital. And he gives a numerical example, which again is quite well based in reality, of £500 capital advanced, £410 on the means of production, the constant capital, and £90 exchanged as a wage. So then he says, okay, so the value produced is a further £90 over and above that original £500. And this notation here is quite important. C plus V is what was advanced, and then plus S plus the surplus value. Okay, so you've got a C plus V plus S. And then he just extends his notation a little bit. And so the commodity that have been produced, and in his example, they would be worth £590 now, where S is £90. So you got 500 plus 90. But you can, if you like, depict the commodity product as the combination of constant plus variable plus surplus value. And this is big C with a dash now, because this is actually the equivalent when it's sold of M dash. So that's 590. Okay. So this is how the surplus value is produced. Now, it's quite careful, Marx's notation here. I just want you to take note of it. C plus V bracketed plus S is one way of expressing it. And then another way of expressing the same thing, but internally it's different, is C and then V plus S. Okay, now why make that difference? Well, that's constant, which is a value transferred, and this is the new value created. V plus S together are the new value. Okay, so V plus S, if you like, are subdivisions of the new value that's created. So the constant transferred is 410, and then 180 worth of new value is created, which in turn is subdivided into the 90 for the variable and the 90 for the surplus value. Okay, so those are the three elements, C plus V plus S, but grouped internally in a different way to bring out a point. And this is a point I'll show you now. Marx does this in order to bring out what he calls the rate of surplus value. And that's the ratio between the S and the V. And in the example he's given us, sorry if you can't see the top, I hope you can. That's 90 over a 90, which would be 100%. He also then talks about the time it takes just to reproduce the value of the labour power, which he calls the necessary labour time. And then he talks about the working time over and above that, which he calls the surplus labour time, which is a second period, which is above and beyond the value of labour power, but which is the surplus when the surplus value gets produced. So there's two ways in which you can conceive the rate of surplus value. One is the S over V, which is the value product, if you like, the 90 over the 90. And the other is the surplus labour time over the necessary labour time, which is the 6 hours over the 6 hours, right? And he says this is the same thing, but it says expressed in different ways, okay? One from the objectified labour, that's in the product, if you like, and one in the process, the living fluid labour. So he's saying that they're two, they by definition, up to this point at least, they by definition are the same, okay? And he says this rate of surplus value in a much more popular way, if you like, is, but he has given us the explanation for the degree of exploitation of labour power by capital, or he says of the worker by the capitalist. Okay, and I've just got a diagram here. Depends how your mind works, I guess. This may or may not help you. So what we have here is the starting point, the capital advanced. I see I haven't updated my numbers. That should be 24 there, actually. That's 27 on this side, and this should be 30 on this side. But the point is that there's an increase of surplus value by 3. Okay, now just returning to this point, new value added is, well, in one example it's 90, and I'll change these numbers to make it more, improve the continuity. In the example we just looked at from Marx, he gives us two different examples. That's what's happened, right? That's this is 410 here, and this is 90, and then the new value is 180, which has got 90 and 90. The point of principle that Marx is arguing is this ratio S over V is exactly the same as this ratio, surplus labour time over necessary labour time, which is why I've drawn it as a triangle, because it's to show that consistency. Okay. Okay, we're getting close to the end, I think. Further points that Marx makes in chapter 9, he does reference forward on two different points to his more developed argument in volume 3, right? The first sort of point, which is a point of development, really, he states, is actually it's not only the rate of surplus value that's important. What's also important is another one, which is the ratio of the surplus value to the total amount of capital that's been advanced. So in our example, that would be 90 over 500. Okay, so that would be 18%, and that he explains later on is the rate of profit. Then we've also got a different point here, which is related to this one in volume 3, which is in its actual fact, in general in the capitalist system, commodities value is not expressed so directly. It's expressed through a mediation, which is called prices of production. Okay, that's one point he makes. Another point he makes, which is now a sort of lead into his discussion of absolute surplus value, is he gives us an example of a rule of thumb used by manufacturers to work out what's going on. I mean, a lot of students often ask this, what doesn't a manufacturer know what's going on in terms of surplus value and so on? Well, unless they're an exceptional individual such as Engels, generally speaking, they have a way of seeing it, which is a class standpoint where they in a kind of way they know, in a kind of way they don't know. How is the only way I can say it, right? And the rule of thumb is this: if you think of the example of our 30 shillings worth of yarn, and this C plus V plus S again, so it's 24 C plus 3 plus 3. This is shillings, okay? So that all adds up to 30 shillings. So 20 pounds of yarn is worth 30 shillings. It has a value of 30 shillings. So each pound of yarn has got a value of 1 shilling, 1.5 shillings, okay? Now, what the rule of thumb is that the manufacturer thinks of the working day in terms of this subdividing the product, right? So they'll say to themselves, right, well, I know I've spent 24 shillings on constant. So, and of that, I spent 20 shillings on cotton. Okay. So in the first 20 hours, in the first part of the day, I've got to recover in the product enough to replace the cotton. And that's what he's doing here. Of the 12 hours, 2/3 of the time is just to replace the value of the cotton. And then he's got 4 shillings buried away in here. I didn't bring it out. The cost of the spindle, and then 3 shillings for the wages. So then each further amount of labor time is replacing the value. Okay, and that's how they come up with the idea that all the profit is made in the last hour, because up to then they've been replacing the value of what they've already spent, and that's where they really make their money. So Marx says this is an incentive, the way the manufacturer sees it, of always trying to add a couple more hours on here at the end, because that's where the profit is really made. Okay, and he uses this idea, which is seen his last hour, leads into the next chapter, which is on absolute surplus value. Now, you may want to discuss this in the reading group. What's the problem? What there's a certain practical truth to what the manufacturer sees here, but at the same time, it's wrong at a different level, and you might want to sort of puzzle your way through that puzzle. Okay, my last set of points now, I guess about another 5 minutes or so. I mean, Marx really delivers. I mean, this is really strong stuff. Okay, he's got to the essence of the capitalist mode of production now. And he's moved from commodity values to the production of surplus value. This material is quite accessible. I've already mentioned that Engels uses it in his sort of rewrite of Wage, Labour and Capital. And it's quite understandable that some authors say, well, if you want to start reading volume 1, start chapter 6 and 7. There is a reason for starting at the beginning, which I do think is worth rehearsing, which is it gives us a commodity form which is based on the unity of use, value and value, and which leads to money as being necessary for commodity production and exchange. And it's surprising how many writers for generations sort of like forgot that bit of Marx's argument, which they try to theorize capitalism without money, basically. So there is a sort of a fundamental aspect to this part 1, but more than that, I think it gives a very you can see when Marx springs from this, like he is really on the money. He's really clear what he's saying. He's using the concepts he's developed this far as points of starting points of contrast. He's really in control of the material. And one of the issues here, which is specific to the capitalist mode of production, which you couldn't really grasp its specificity without this previous discussion, is labor power is a commodity. To put it another way, what he's saying is the capitalist mode of production relies on the formation of labor markets where labor power can be bought and sold, because capital has got a monopoly over the means of production. And he brings out the uniqueness of labor power as a commodity. Okay, so this is just confirming a point I've already said, which is really my summary of Marx's argument. Now, if you're not keen on Hegel, look away now. I won't spend too much time on this, but it is of interest to me, the observations on methodology, just to understand what Marx is doing at what point. And he's really giving us an initial quite abstract treatment of the concept of surplus value before he goes into the different configurations of it. And you can detect, I think, the influence of Hegel's science of logic here. And it's not linear. It's not that like part 1 is being part 3 is essence, and so on, right? Marx reworks this material and sort of subordinates it to the content which he's giving us, which is the political economy. But there is this notion of essence, and surplus value is the essential category. Now, Marx's surplus essential category is a double relation. And it's this double relation which will be developed from its initial sort of presentation as a concept. And he does this in 2 ways, right? The first way, I've sort of labored the point, I guess, right? He's going to be looking at different ways of increasing surplus value, but he's also looking at it from the point of view of objective, if you like, and subjective as well. There are 2 aspects to the development of this concept, what it means for capital, but also what it means for labor. I mean, capital is the dominant here, but labor is never forgotten. The perspective of labor is never forgotten. In fact, it's the whole purpose of the exercise, right? And just in this, we're talking about a movement from a fairly abstract statement of the universal to a more and more concrete one. Okay, to the way it actually appears. And this is Marx's difference with Hegel, right? His central concept of essence, surplus value, is not a paradox. It expresses a real antagonism. It's a contradiction in the full sense of the term. So the main part of volume 1, I would summarize as Marx's theory of surplus value. Okay, 2 last points. There is still a narrowness in the way he treats the beginning of it's interesting, right? This is actually a commodity chain in modern parlance, but he doesn't formulate it this way around, but it's kind of like present. It's not given as an angle of analysis in any developed way, but we've got spinning, we've got weaving, and before the spinning there was a production of cotton. So Marx does recognize that cotton has a value and it's produced by socially necessary hours of labor. And so, but its role is like an assumed precondition. And I do think there's an ambiguity in what Marx leaves us. I mean, there's points here in the section you're going to read, right, where he basically uses slavery as a point of contrast with developed capitalism. I think he's using very liberal sources, actually. And I find the sources quite a bit prejudicial, having read the original sources, right? But also, there are other parts later on, and definitely the one that's quoted by Marini is actually an excellent perspective on it. So there's different takes. He never quite brings this all into focus. And that's, in a sense, it's fair enough, but in another sense, it's an unfinished business as well. My final sort of commentary is, you may find this a little bit technical, but there is a debate in the Brazilian literature about what is being exploited. The actual literal section heading by Marx is the exploitation of labor power. And now Marini writes about the super exploitation of labor. So is there a distinction between the exploitation of labor and the exploitation of labor power? I don't think you can really separate them. I don't find it a very fruitful discussion, but you may want to think about it at least, because actually you cannot separate the laborer from their labor power. I mean, they can be alienated, but they can't be separated. And similarly, the case with their labor. Therefore, and Marx actually does say this at one point, what we were talking about, not only the exploitation of the labor power, but the exploitation of the worker, of the laborer. So this is homework if you want to take it in addition to what you're already doing. Yesterday's Guardian, I guess it's the Observer because it's a Sunday, had 2 stories you might want to look at in terms of how a classically liberal newspaper almost presents what exploitation is and how capitalists can increase exploitation, but also what their concept of exploitation is and how it's different to the Marxist concept. And I was very pleased to see that the question of a general strike was actually being discussed for the first time in my memory on BBC Radio yesterday. But of course, the idea of a general strike in the UK is slightly ambitious against the reality. But I do want to tell you there is a general strike going on in Ecuador right now. It's a very different reality, a very different experience of capitalism. And it's been going on for the last week. This is the further reading. And this is, I'd like to thank Tim for this reference, Andrew Blunden for helpful reference. And the next lecture will be on the 18th of July. And with that, I look forward to the discussion.